And I think what's important to understand with that is that, women will choose home birth or birth center birth. They will choose to give birth in the place where they feel safe to birth their baby, regardless of what the state or lawmakers think about that choice. Just like women make their other reproductive health decisions on the basis of personal private factors, regardless of what lawmakers think of those choices. So, for example, what we know in studies about abortion law around the world is that when abortion is made illegal, it doesn't really change the incidence of abortion. It doesn't change the sort of number of times women choose to seek out an abortion. What it does is drives up maternal mortality. It makes women die from the choice to get an abortion. They need to get the abortion for a private personal reason that has nothing to do with whatever some lawmaker thinks about whether they should make that choice. And the effort to drive it underground doesn't change the choice. It just punishes them for the choice.
Hermine, thank you so much for coming back to the show. You and I have become dear friends over the years after having met, years ago. You were giving a presentation at Cedars-Sinai. Milo Chavira was like, you need to come and attend this. I was a resident. I was already like kind of disillusioned with things. And I saw you present there about, general topics. I don't even remember what you were talking about because I was so enamored with you, but informed consent, how autonomy is being encroached upon within the maternity care system in the United States. Of course, we're in this busy, city, Los Angeles, with multiple hospitals where there's just so much activity happening. And when you present things, topics, it comes off as not only respectful and compassionate, but you're able to make it digestible for almost anybody, which is why I wanted you to come on today and talk a little bit about this recent Nebraska, Nebraska. Why am I having a brain fart? Trial. Excuse me. Thank you.
It was a trial.
Yeah. So Angie Hawk is a midwife in Nebraska. You were representing her, and I think many people listening have probably heard a little bit about this. But why don't you just tell briefly, sort of the nuts and bolts of what this trial was about? It had a great outcome, and we'll get into that. But let's talk a little bit about what the trial in brief was all about.
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you, Nathan, for having me on your show. It's delightful to have a conversation with you, as always. So this trial that you're referring to happened in mid-December in Omaha, Nebraska. I was invited to join an excellent legal team based in Omaha in defending a midwife there named Angela Hawk. She's a direct entry midwife, not a certified nurse midwife. And most home birth midwives in the United States are direct entry midwives, not nurse midwives. But direct entry midwives are only legal or licensed to practice and recognized as legal providers in 37 U.S. states, and they are not recognized as legal providers in the remaining 12 states. And the reasons for that are really about the history of medical competition toward midwives, which is why midwives kind of went away from U.S. maternity care for over 50 years in the 20th century. And they're still making their way back into maternity care in the U.S. It's still a process. We're still trying to get midwives back into maternity care in the U.S. And it's a patchwork across states about whether they're recognized, whether they're present in hospitals, whether they are independent. and whether they're allowed to serve women at home. And so Nebraska is one of these states that strongly circumscribes women's rights in childbirth legally. Certified nurse midwives are allowed to exist in the state of Nebraska, but the law explicitly says, the law that licenses and regulates certified nurse midwives explicitly says that they may only attend women in childbirth in the hospital or in a clinic. And so therefore, nurse midwives are explicitly not allowed to attend women at home, or they might lose their license. And then direct entry midwives, also known as certified professional midwives, when they get that certification from the North American Registry of Midwives, they aren't recognized as legal providers at all. And so in those states where they're not recognized, they still exist. But their practice is driven underground. And I think what's important to understand with that is that, women will choose home birth or birth center birth. They will choose to give birth in the place where they feel safe to birth their baby, regardless of what the state or lawmakers think about that choice. Just like women make their other reproductive health decisions beg your pardon, on the basis of personal private factors, regardless of what lawmakers think of those choices. So, for example, what we know in studies about abortion law around the world is that when abortion is made illegal, it doesn't really change the incidence of abortion. It doesn't change the sort of number of times women choose to seek out an abortion. What it does is drives up maternal mortality. It makes women die from the choice to get an abortion. They need to get the abortion for a private personal reason that has nothing to do with whatever some lawmaker thinks about whether they should make that choice. And the effort to drive it underground doesn't change the choice. It punishes them for the choice. And so it is with out of hospital birth. In those places where it is underground, women still choose it. But the process of finding a midwife, instead of happening in the light and air and in a free marketplace where you can really engage about the person's history and reputation and stuff, it more in underground states, it looks like a crack deal where someone whispers the name of the midwife, slides it across a table, you meet in a cafe, everything's like said in sort of doublespeak kind of stuff because of the legal vulnerability around it. So that's Nebraska. And there are always a few brave midwives willing to serve even in those kinds of legal conditions. Angela Hawk is one of those people. And she has been attending women as a traditional midwife, an unlicensed traditional midwife, in Nebraska, in the Omaha area, with explicit informed consent. Women understood, choosing her, that she was not a certified nurse midwife. She's not an OB. This is not a hospital. This is Angie's home, and she's going to come to your home and attend you there. And so in 2019, Angie attended a couple. There was a surprise breach during the birth, and when the baby delivered, it got stuck, it's one of the risks of a vaginal breech birth. And then there was a transfer. The EMTs were not trained or equipped for a neonatal transfer or any kind of birth emergency. And even though they could easily be trained and equipped for that, the state has made a decision not to prepare them. And when the state makes a decision not to train and equip ambulance people for birth transfers, you can expect that people are going to die in birth transfers because that's a really important link. So again, that's a state decision to let people die preventable deaths in childbirth because the mother dared to make the choice to have her baby at home, a choice that is treated as a normal healthcare choice in many other countries, Holland, the United Kingdom, Canada, Northern Europe. It's really, the United States has made the choice for home birth questionable and weird, only because the doctors had the power to do that, not because it is in fact a weird choice. So these people chose to have their babies at home, but again, the system was not integrated. The baby did not survive, and within hours of the mom arriving at the hospital for that medical emergency care, the doctors had called the police on the midwife. When the parents got home, the parents were interrogated at their dying baby's bedside by the police. By the time they got home, police were waiting for them. DHS was waiting for them to threaten their older toddler. And the midwife had her home raided by the police in front of all of her children. They all went through hell. They confiscated her husband's, work materials. This is what they do when they raid the homes of home birth midwives. Of course, needless to say, an obstetrician's home is never raided for the death of a baby. Home birth midwives' homes are raided for the death of a baby. And then, and it was big press. New York Times wrote about it. People magazine wrote about it. It was all over the Midwestern press, midwife murders baby kind of stuff. And then she waited 3.5 years. The family had been dragged through hell waiting for their midwife to be put on trial. They were not allowed to talk with her. But their privacy obviously was massively violated through all the press around this case. And
Family experienced the death of their baby.
Yes, the family who experienced the death of their baby had to, in addition to experiencing the tragic loss of their child, had to go through years of massive trauma and public shaming, designed to essentially act as if someone was bad to, it was all about the blame in a way that it wouldn't be if that child had died for the same reasons in the hospital.
Wow.
So really all about using media and social pressure to further drive the choice for home birth underground. And in these cases, when a death in a home birth is all over the press, while deaths in hospital happen every day around childbirth and they're never in the press, the reason for that is cultural. It has nothing to do with the law. It has nothing to do with medicine, really. It has to do with sort of reinforcing the cultural value and belief in the United States that safe childbirth happens in the hospital and only the hospital, and that if you leave the jurisdiction of the doctors and give birth anywhere else, then you're asking for death, and if death happens, it's your fault, and it's the fault of anybody who encouraged the birthing woman to allow herself to make such a choice. So such was the charge against Angie Hawk. The charge was child neglect resulting in death, with a potential sentence of up to 20 years in prison. Angie Hawk is herself also a mother with small children up through teenagers. And so she and her family have been waiting for this trial, for years to see what was going to happen. And so finally we went to trial. Again, this fabulous team, Stuart Dornan and his son, Keith Dornan, and their amazing paralegal, Shelby Logan Hale, were already the very capable team on the ground in Omaha for Angie. They brought me in to support with my, experience around midwifery issues in particular, and specifically around all the choice issues that were pertinent to this case and to Angie's defense. So I think a week before the trial, we got a notice that Court TV was going to live stream the whole thing, and that order had been granted. And again, I think Court TV wanted to live stream it because the public is interested. And why is the public interested? Because they're interested in seeing a witch burn. In order to reinforce, so everybody can celebrate our shared cultural beliefs or the childbirth belongs in the hospital.
Wow. Well, I'll add, so for anybody out there, if you want to see the whole trial, you can go to YouTube and search Court TV midwifery. This is, a little hat tip to the language that you described earlier. Midwifery Delivery Death Trial is how it was titled. Angela Hawk is the name of the midwife. And I know Angie. She's lovely. She's passionate. She knows what she's doing. And this is just one of those cases where it can happen to anybody. And fortunately, Angie was able to keep her chin up and to sit through this whole process and hopefully eventually find some closure here. But when you go to YouTube and watch this, if you go to day 3, you'll actually get to see an impressive cross-examination by our guest here, Hermine, of the physician who blew the whistle, so to speak, and sort of got these charges moving. Can you talk a little bit about what was revealed about the death of this poor little baby, and perhaps some of the relevant points that you were able to tease out in this cross-examination? Because it was brilliant. If you guys haven't seen it, go watch it.
Well, thank you for your encouragement. And I think that what you're getting to here is that there weren't so many witnesses in this trial. The main prosecuting witness was probably the obstetrician who had mobilized the criminal prosecution of the midwife. And so we got to have this conversation in our cross-examination. It lasted 3.5 hours. And I think that, this obstetrician had integrity, and she was very intelligent. And so she was willing to tell the truth. She was willing to sort of lay out some of her internal contradictions, the contradictions between what she had learned in her training and what was common in her practice, and in the process to reveal some of the cognitive disconnects between theory and practice in obstetrics. So, our conversation really started talking largely around medical ethics and decision-making, who gets to make the decision and why. And again, she had the integrity to acknowledge that birthing women have the right to make the decisions about their care, and that they have the right to refuse offers of treatment, including the offer cesarean surgery. And I applaud her for that, because I've talked with obstetricians who actually won't even acknowledge that birthing women have a right to refuse surgery. And if you ask them about it, they'll just say basically some version of, well, we tell them and we tell them again and we tell them, and if we tell them enough in the right way, they fold. You know what I mean? I've heard that. And the reality is, it's true. Women are in an incredibly vulnerable position when they're in labor, and they can be pressured and coerced to doing what doctors want. And that happens so often that doctors come out believing women don't make decisions, we make it for them, rather than recognize, wow, we're coercing every woman who comes through here. So again, the doctor had the integrity to recognize, in theory, what is that?
It's a vaporized bag of herbs with a little bit of tobacco. It's grounding me.
I have never seen anything like that.
Pre-ayahuasca ceremony over here.
Love you. Okay. All right. I'm going to start over with that moment. We can edit around it. What I really enjoyed about my conversation with this Dr. Lessman, and I think was valuable for both of us and for anybody who watches the conversation, is that we got to talk through really first a couple of ACOG opinions that sort of that reflect accurately what doctors are actually supposed to do. We talked about, because this case involved breach, we talked about ACOG's 2018 statement on breach, providing sort of, practice guidance to obstetrician gynecologists across the United States. And for listeners, that's American College of OB-GYNs, who are the body that represent and also provide guidance based on the latest studies, et cetera, to ob-gyns. And so in 2018, they issued a statement on breach that digested the latest science. In 2006, ACOG had issued a statement on breach that reflected something that has come to be known as the Hannah trial. And if anybody's interested in breach, you can Google that. And that was basically a study that suggested that breech babies born by cesarean might do better than breech babies born vaginally, have a higher rate of survival. And on the basis of that study, like that, obstetricians decided in the US and elsewhere, those who followed Americans, to just tell women they weren't allowed to have vaginal breech anymore, and that their only option was C-section. And so,
if anybody wants to read it, just Google the term breech trial. If you want to add Hannah, Hannah, you'll find it, but it's since been, I hate this word, debunked. It's not really what happened. It's
discredited. Discredited is a very important word, and it has been discredited. I mean, that's one of the things. It's like, and Nathan, I think you can also speak to this, like in obstetric culture, when a study comes out that says, let's do more expensive intervention, it's adopted like that. If it gives any reason to do more expensive interventions, it's adopted overnight. And if a study comes out that actually speaks to, let's do less interventions, let's support physiology more, it's like, you know what, we'll need 200 more studies on that before we could really assess. And then it's got to go through our policy people. And maybe in 200 years, we can start putting that into practice. The problem is that actually we've got a lot of momentum around these unnecessary interventions, like that. It's like that.
Yeah.
So a very classic example on the other side is that is what they call delayed cord clamping, but really it's the absence of premature cord clamping. If you clamp that cord while it's still pulsing, you are depriving the baby of oxygen that its brain needs. And so the studies have shown that let that cord stop pulsing. But they're still not doing it. For years it was, did a midwife make that study? I'm sorry, we're not going to recognize that study. Stuff like that. So with breech, as soon as the study came out that said cut them all out, they were like, a study says cut them all out, we're cutting them all out.
Change everybody's practice just overnight.
Don't even bother to learn how to help it out of the vagina. Make it so that if it comes out of the vagina, it's going to die because you don't know how to do it.
That's where we're at. I've spoken I have spoken on this topic, so I don't think anybody's going to be a stranger to that. But it is helpful to have it reiterated by
Increase the danger of vaginal birth by increasing our negligence relative to vaginal birth. Let's make it so the only thing we can say we know how to do is surgery. And then let's tell all the women their only option is surgery because breech is so dangerous, rather than because we don't know how to do it, because we forgot how to do it, because we let ourselves forget how to do it. That's the reality of breech. And in 2018, ACOG came out and said, there's really not science to back that up, actually. So women, actually, and actually the 2018 study isn't great, because I don't think the 2018 study authors have really read the 2016 ethics position statement on maternal refusal of medically recommended treatment, because the 2018 is still talking as if, well, we can allow it out of their vagina here, or maybe not here, but it really, every single statement should be grounded in the constitutional right to refuse surgery. It's only ever an offer of surgery, docs. It's only ever an offer that she has the right to accept or decline. So, but at least the 2018 says there's risks on either side. The offer, maybe should be made. And one of the valuable things it says is women should be informed that the risks to the baby may be higher with vaginal delivery relative to surgical delivery. And may means maybe not. We actually don't even know. And that's just short-term perinatal risk. As we know, studies around safety to the baby, studies around the safety of cesarean usually only focus on short-term perinatal risk. They ignore all the other health effects to the baby, long-term risks to the baby, risks to the mother, don't matter at all.
Future, your fifth C-section, that's a hell of a surgery, your fifth C-section. Yeah, that's all the stuff composite scores don't really take into account. Exactly.
Yeah. And so with Dr. Lessman, we talked about it in 2018, and with that, she was able to acknowledge that ACOG recognized that science is always evolving, that practice is always evolving, and that at this point, there's not really support for telling women your only option is surgery for breech, that actually the position of ACOG, it's still being trotted out as your only option is surgery. And then even more importantly, we talked through the 2016 ACOG statement on the maternal refusal of medically recommended treatment, which has all of these great lines about, coercion, duress, manipulation are never ethically permissible. And of course, very important to Angela Hawk's case was that it actually said, ACOG discourages in the strongest possible terms any obstetrician from involving the police or CPS to try to coerce, pressure, manipulate, or punish women with regard to their medical decision-making, which, as you know, Nathan, now from the work you do down here in the trenches with women, talking to doulas, this happens a lot. Women are coerced and manipulated and told that their only option is a C-section every single day in obstetric care. And it's culturally normal, despite the fact that the ACOG ethics statement says it's impermissible. It's impermissible, and yet it's happening every day. And so in this discussion with Dr. Lessman, she was willing and able to acknowledge that, for example, manipulation is when a doctor only emphasizes the benefits of the thing that they want the patient to do, leaves the risks of that thing off the table, and doesn't mention the benefits of the thing they don't want them to do, and only emphasizes the risks of the thing they don't want them to do. If you're following what I just said, that's manipulation. When you say, well, if you do a vaginal birth, your baby's going to die and your uterus is going to explode and you're going to end up with a hysterectomy. And if you do a C-section, it's going to be quick and you're going to feel in control and you might have a tiny bikini scar. And the biggest risk is that you might have more procedures later. That's one of the biggest lies told women around cesarean section. And you might have more procedures later is the closest the OBs come to acknowledging the risk of death to the mother. So that was what was so valuable with Dr. Lessman. First, we had this talk about ethics, where she acknowledged accurately what is ethical behavior and what is unethical behavior on the part of birthing providers. And then we talked through midwives, because she had said to the police that Angie Hawk was negligent and that baby definitely would have lived if it had received proper medical care, and that it was Angie's fault that the baby didn't. And so unpacking, was she negligent? Which, she wasn't by any standard.
Spoiler.
Right. But what I was able to show with Dr. Lessman was that when she said she's negligent, when she calls the police and says that she was negligent, she's talking about, negligent it means different things. The charge against Angie was negligent child abuse resulting in death, which has a specific meaning in criminal law, which is that you knew that the baby was at risk of death and didn't care. You know what I mean? That's a specific, while within medical malpractice and the world of medicine and professional, what Dr. Lessman's thinking probably when she says negligence is violated the standard of care, violated the standard of care for this professional, which is a different thing than knew somebody's going to die and don't care. You know what I mean? But even that, what's the standard of care that Angie breached here, doctor? The only standard of care she even knew about was the ob-gyn and maybe the nurse midwife. And she acknowledged she never would have expected a lay midwife, as she perceived Angie, to even know about those standards of care, let alone follow them. So how could she be negligent under that standard of care? And she doesn't know anything about the midwife standard of care because she doesn't know anything about midwives. She showed that in her testimony. She was willfully ignorant about midwives, even though she'd practiced in Washington State, where midwives are a big part of maternal health care. She was from Nebraska and she'd been trained in Missouri. So she didn't bother to understand what those midwives are, how they work, what their scope was. It was like, I just assumed they were just underground lay, like
naive. She just doesn't know. She really had.
Right. And but naive implies like an innocence. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't even know what I didn't know kind of thing. And I think there's more, I think we can hold obstetricians more responsible for not bothering to understand who are these people transferring and birthing women. I would be curious. If I was an obstetrician.
She's not an obstetrician. Wasn't she a pathologist or something?
She's an obstetrician. Our expert was a placental pathologist.
Gotcha.
This is an obstetrician who's also an associate professor of obstetrics at the University of Nebraska Medical Center.
Gotcha.
So this obstetrician, who had worked as an obstetrician in 3 hospitals, including Washington, didn't know anything about midwives. And what she thought she knew, she had learned from, she acknowledged, hospital-based nurse midwives who perceived those midwives to be their competition. So there's a problem when we're allowing hostile competitors to define a profession. And so that proved that she couldn't have, there was no negligence that she could talk about with regard to Angie Hawk. And then we brought that farther home in bringing, now let's talk through what would have happened if this mom had come to the hospital where you were on call that night and what would have happened. And what was super interesting about that was that when the doctor was asked how would you have counseled her on her options, what she would have done was exactly what she had already defined as unethical, which is exactly right. You know what I mean? Like, that's reality. Like that's why that mom didn't want to go in. That's why moms don't want to go in, because you're going to lie to me and you're going to manipulate me. So what she would have done was, it's safest for you to have a C-section. Your baby's breech, it's safest for you to have a C-section. But wait, didn't you already define that as unethical? You don't get to say what's safest. She gets to say what's safest. You get to tell her what the different medical risks are on either side of her options. And she gets to say what's safest. And then it's like, okay, well, what would you have? I would have told her baby could die. What would you tell her about her risk of accreta? Would you have asked her how many babies she's planning to have? And the answer was essentially, come on, it would have been late at night. It would have been like 9:45. So no, I might not mention the risk of her dying. and then it's like, what would you have told her about her risk of accreta? And again, she's answering honestly. This is what women are being told. I would have told her she had a risk of a future procedure. What is that procedure? Are you talking about the procedure that you do when her placenta grows through? She is now massively hemorrhaging. Is it true that those procedures, would that procedure be to try to save her life? Yes. And is it true that sometimes those procedures don't work and sometimes mothers die? Yes. She wouldn't have been told that. And is it that, can you acknowledge, doctor, that we have rising maternal mortality in the United States, and that it has been acknowledged that that rising maternal mortality is linked to the overuse of cesarean and placenta accreta? Yes, but none of that would have been told to the mother. Instead, she would have been told her safest choice was to let herself get cut open. And if she doesn't, that's something wrong with the mother. Because why is she even thinking about the risk that we didn't tell her about?
So Hermine, I just got to pause you, because at the pivotal moment when you said the uterus or the placenta goes through, your audio cut out. So I just want to catch everybody up. You were saying you were just describing the accreta spectrum disorders, which is when I was describing what the doctor was saying when I asked the doctor, how would you have counseled the mother about risks to the mother from cesarean section? Did that come through? I mean, I want to give them the words. Everything came through, but I just want to fill in the words. Please just give me a second. when the placenta grows through the wall of the uterus and it can become attached to other organs, that is what you were saying, but it cut that out and everything else came through. So please continue. I just wanted to make sure people knew what you were saying.
You want me to back up and say that point again?
Oh, no. Everything else came through, but it was sort of like saying my favorite food is, and then the favorite food didn't actually get said. So continue.
Placenta accreta is probably the biggest risk to the mother from repeat cesarean section. And it is a risk that is not really discussed with women in counseling, even though it is the risk that we know from a public health perspective is tied to our rising maternal mortality.
Right.
And so, you know, this is everything. This is everything that we need to know about maternal health care and what women are going through when they're pregnant in the USA, that like people are pushing surgeries on them that are increasing their risk of dying, and they are dying. And yet the obstetricians and the other providers that are pushing those surgeries on them truly in the moment feel, based on their own blinders, the fact that they themselves aren't seeing those downstream risks, or all of the variables that are the reason why the law gives the patient the authority to make the medical decision. The doctor doesn't see those variables, which is why it's not the doctor's decision to make. You know what I mean? And so the woman, she submits. That's what happens. She submits because she's been taught all her life to submit. She's been taught all her life to be pleasing. And so she submits and she's pleasing, and she walks out of there with paying the price. She pays the price, and her baby pays the price, and her downstream babies pay the price for the convenience, the short-term convenience to that obstetrician and that team.
Okay, so that is going to be let's transition to that, because that's actually really, I think, one of the beautiful things that you and I have waxed kind of philosophical about over our past conversations. But before we do, why is it that some midwives are charged with homicide when this happens versus, in this case, they were pulling a negligence card? Like, what was so different about this case?
Well, I mean, I think that the decision about what to charge criminally when there's a criminal case is always the discretion of the prosecuting attorney's office, maybe the district attorney or the district attorney. And I'm not privy to how they make that analysis, in why, for example, in North Carolina, they're going to proceed with murder, and over here it's negligent homicide, and over here it's child neglect resulting in death, and over here it's practicing medicine without a license. It's really down to the politics of that jurisdiction vis-a-vis home birth midwifery. But obviously, the higher the stakes of that charge, once you get out of practicing midwifery or medicine without a license, which they could have, that was the charge, that is the charge, really. Once you get into homicide, anything past practicing medicine without a license is trying to hold the midwife responsible for the outcome. You know what I mean? And so at all of that, it's just trying to make the price of being a midwife too high for any potential midwife to pay. It's really how hard is the state willing to work to make it that every woman goes to the hospital for childbirth.
Okay.
The way that I think about it is the law, the state is allowing itself to be weaponized to get all the cows into the barn, and midwives are being punished for letting the cow out of the barn.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's a beautiful metaphor. Thank you. Okay, so we've got this trial. We are seeing women are giving, quote, consent. They're providing what I'm using air quotes on my end if you're listening, because informed consent has been disfigured quite a bit, substantially, I would say, especially in maternity care, because the person who's being provided counseling in order to make that consent is a woman. Let's get a little bit into what you were talking about, sort of the agreeableness that women are conditioned to adopt, which translates into their care. Even when there's somebody who they may respect and has taken good care of them, now they're providing this information. Something maybe doesn't feel right about it, but they just kind of feel like they're compelled to go with the flow. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Let's go deeper on that topic.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that, one of the lines in that ACOG statement that I discussed with Dr. Lessman during that trial is this line that says, that that obstetricians should be aware of power differentials that are at stake in medical decision making during childbirth, and that it's an ethical issue, to exploit that power differential in order to steer a birthing woman toward the choice that the provider prefers for that woman. And I think that's what you're starting to get to, with this line of discussion. I mean, like, already in any hospital situation, even if you're a grown man, right? Like, if you're in a doctor-patient dynamic where you're lying on your back in a hospital bed, you're naked except for a hospital gown, and especially if you're in pain, if you have ever had an experience like that, Nathan, or listeners that haven't been pregnant might have had that kind of an experience. If you feel really vulnerable, and then you're in a discussion with your providers about what you should do medically. They're standing, they're fully dressed, they're not in pain. They're like, the stakes of the conversation are different for them than they are for you. The patient can feel there's already a power differential in that dynamic that the provider has a responsibility to be sensitive to. With childbirth, I think it's even more so. I mean, because the pain is powerful. It can be powerful for some reason. For some people, of course, childbirth is not painful or even pleasurable, but for a lot of people, it can be really intense and take a lot of focus to really manage or feel like you're managing. And then you're bringing your baby into the world, like most pregnancies that are at presenting for care in a hospital setting are not for adoption. These are people who want this baby to come home with them. Their hope and intention, they've been growing this baby and gestating it to birth the baby and bring the baby home. And that is a time of tremendous joy, expectation. It's a sacred time. It's a sacred time for families. And so that's another aspect of what's happening in childbirth. Is like the birthing woman, whatever partner is there, they have all this hope, expectation. They want it to go well. They want to have a joyful relationship with these people that are helping the baby to come into the world. And so they want to be pleasing, right? They want it to go well. And so if that person is communicating, there's really only one thing you can do to please me here, and otherwise I'm going to be displeased. That's a power dynamic that's now in place in that exchange.
Yeah.
And then they feel a high dependency on their providers, because not only is there a hope that this is going to be a beautiful, sacred moment, but we're all carrying narratives of death and childbirth that we've all grown up hearing, based on pre-medical history, when we didn't have antibiotics, when we didn't have anti-hemorrhagics, et cetera. People died. And so, this idea that childbirth is associated with death, which it still is, of course, there's no guarantee of a healthy outcome from childbirth, is another layer of vulnerability, another layer of dependence that can be manipulated to control and to override the rights of the patient. And then underneath all of that, we have gender and sex, and the fact that the vast majority of people presenting to birth a baby identify as gender female, and have been, and even if they don't identify as gender female, they were probably brought up, socialized with expectations of femaleness if they have a uterus. And the expectations of femaleness in Western culture involve holding the social fabric together by being sweet, being pleasing, being non-confrontational, not making conflict. Females feel strong pressure to not create conflict, but instead to smooth conflict, to hold relationships together, to not present as angry. There's as much pressure on women as there is on Black people to not be angry, because if we allow ourselves to present as angry, that would be pretty threatening to an order in which women and people of color are deprived of their rights and their power in a given culture. So all women are carrying that programming into pregnancy and into labor and delivery. And as with any other programming that we carry into any other aspect of our lives, if we're conscious of it, then we can navigate it. We can be aware when it's coming up. We can maybe not be subject to it. But if we're not conscious of it, it's going to control our behavior. And the way in which that can play out in L&D is this desire to please, even in this face, even when women get frightened, right? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. I think fawn is one of the most likely things to come out in L&D.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's sort of the baseline issue, and that what we were talking about, Nathan.
I think that, one big thing that I really do quite a bit of counseling for my clients on is this radical responsibility piece. I want everybody to be able to make autonomous decisions. I want them to have as much information and support in making that decision as I can possibly muster. And clients who come to me, I have 100% satisfaction rate in that regard, because I have also helped to help them remember that this decision about your body, cutting into your body, what's going to happen to you and your baby, ultimately it comes to you. But when we reclaim that responsibility, we also have to own the outcomes. That is not a big problem in the home birth community. But if you're in this power dynamic that you're describing, and somebody walks in, shoves their hand into your vagina, they haven't even really introduced themselves, you are now, you're on their turf, and they have this sort of habituated way of doing things. And when you're pregnant, let's say you're late 20s, that's a pretty common time for most women to have their first pregnancy. This might be the first time that you've actually sort of been encouraged to really make decisions for yourself. You've outsourced your power for decades now. And at this point in time, you have the ability to say, no, thank you. I'm okay over here doing my own thing. But that's a really hard time to be making that first decision. So with this power, differential, and with all of this conditioning and mother culture, sort of expecting women to act a certain way, I'll take it one step further from L&D. My wife always says this is, like, you don't realize that when we women are alone walking down the street and a man comes up really close into our space, we smile, we make them feel, like we're totally okay with this. But deep down inside, we might feel threatened. We might feel like this guy might be violent. He might rape me, whatever else. But the smiling, the sort of niceties, the politeness, that is all a part of the conditioning that also, in one regard, just out on the streets, out, when the bars let out or whatever, that's actually a form of self-preservation as well. How can we detach ourselves from that conditioning when we're in such a vulnerable space on a maternity unit? That's something that I speak to a lot and with my clients on my podcast and everything else. So I'm glad that you elaborated on that, because I think that this is really one of the keys of what is going so wrong within hospitals. Women having unmedicated, undisturbed births, and they still feel like something energetically was wrong about that experience. And it's probably for all of the reasons that you're describing, and then some. There's a lot of true obstetric violence out there. So anyways, I've my diatribe is over. Anything you want to add to that? Because this is a really compelling. I think it's very important for people to hear it.
Well, I don't think that was a diatribe. I think we're in conversation. And that point that you just made about the smiling is really valuable, because, the smiling, like, again, I think it's not only that we're taught to hold the social fabric together, and but it's really that we're taught to think about how the other feels. You know what I mean? We're socialized to empathize. And I doubt that women biologically have different things in our brain to allow us to empathize, and everybody's capable of empathizing. And it's interesting how often I hear women call men narcissists. And I think a lot of times what's happening there is that women are identifying, they're feeling like, hey, this guy isn't demonstrating a level of empathy, in whatever situation, that is so easy for me to feel, identify, etc. Because again, we're really taught to think about how are they feeling, so that even if someone's attacking us, and we're saying, no, stop, we're thinking about how they feel at the same, almost, we sometimes lose track of how we feel and the thinking about how others feel. I think that's a thing. It's a thing for women. And so, that smiling, something that I'm a mother of two sons, that are coming into their teen years, that are growing to be young men, and issues of consent are still very real in their generation. I hear it being talked about with mothers who are mothers of daughters, that are trying to, it's still a thing where there's sexual conflicts happening between young men and women in our post-feminist world. And how is that sort of thing? Well, because these same socializations are actually still kind of in place for boys and girls around emotion. And so it's still the case that girls are having a hard time clearly communicating no. And so what I actually, to speak to your smiling point, like something that I realized, in the context of trying to help my sons to understand female ways of communicating. And of course, not all women communicate the same way. Not all men communicate the same way, right? When we're talking about like gendered norms, we're not talking about individuals. But that if a girl says no and she's smiling because she wants to stay in connection with you. She's not smiling because she doesn't mean the no that's coming out of her mouth. That has been a big point of misunderstanding between men and women. You know what I mean? So where he's pushing for someone, she's saying, no, 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 no. She's saying it like that because she doesn't want to lose him and she doesn't want to make him mad. And not only because she doesn't want him to hurt her. That for sure, women get killed by men, but also because she just doesn't want to lose him. You know what I mean? She doesn't want him to be mad at her. She wants them to be cool. She likes him. There's a dynamic here that makes her uncomfortable. Ditto with L&D. You know what I mean? The birthing woman doesn't want that doctor or those nurses to leave forever. They want them to stay and help them give birth. They do want to say no to what's happening here. So they're saying it with a smile. So they're saying it with a way that is like, I know that you guys, God, how often am I hearing birthing women centralize their empathy for the providers over themselves? And everybody who talks about childbirth who wasn't in that room centralizes their empathy for the doctor over the birthing woman. It's always, well, how would the doctor have feel? And do you know how stressed they are? They work long days. And what are their resources? I very rarely hear that level of empathy provided to the actual woman who was birthing the baby and having the most important day of her life. I hear far more empathy communicated to a regular work day for a team of providers than for a woman who came out with an unnecessary abdominal surgery. That is routine, right? So it's not just that women are lacking empathy for themselves. They're in a society that lacks empathy for them, right? So they're doing what their whole society is gearing them to do, which is to empathize with those people who have more power than they do. And so in that situation, so when we get to what's the solution for us women, it's like, it's really recognizing that you can say no and that you're not rejecting anybody. It's getting over this idea that setting a boundary it completely violates your obligations as a social person to be sweet and be pleasing. You know what I mean? Like I once heard this Canadian doula. I was giving a talk to midwives on sticking together when they advocate for their shared interests and not stabbing each other in the back, which they often do as women. And a midwife in the back raised her hand and said, I find it hard to be in a relationship with women who don't have good boundaries. She said, a woman who has good boundaries, if you do something that hurts or offends her, she'll tell you what you did. She'll tell you that she's mad. You can talk about it. You can work it out. A woman who doesn't have good boundaries, if you've offended her, you'll feel that she's upset with you, but she won't tell you why. You might even ask, is something wrong? And she'll be like, no, nothing's wrong. We've all been there, right? But you can feel something's wrong. And the actions that she's taking on the basis of her unspoken resentment are actually making the trust fall out from your relationship in a way that could have been avoided if she'd just be straight with you. And when she said that, I had a revelation because I had always thought of boundaries as pushing people away, you know what I mean? As like TMI, you know what I mean? That sort of thing, but which I would never do. Like, you can tell me all your information, like, come on close. Yeah.
Rejecting them. Yeah. Pushing them away. I hear you.
Exactly. That it's a rejection. But what she was presenting was the idea of boundaries as actually an inviting them to come closer, you know what I mean? As trusting, as loving the other person enough to not lie to them, which is what we're socialized to do when we make ourselves disappear and our actual true feelings disappear. Loving them enough, respecting them enough, wanting to stay in connection with them enough to say, listen, these are my needs. This is what I need from you in this relationship. And this is what I'm asking you for. Can you do that for me so that we can stay in connection? Yeah. That's actually inviting someone closer, and there's nothing rejecting about it. It's honoring you and them, and so it's like I feel like that's a key here for women and also for the doulas that serve them, is to understand, is to really examine our relationship to the setting of boundaries and the using of our voices. and being willing to face the discomfort that might come up if somebody pushes back at us like, hey, you're not allowed to set a boundary. You're supposed to just be sweet and pleasing. Because that's the moment when you can say, my darling, I do matter and I have a need here. And I love you enough to tell you what it is. I love you enough to tell you that I said no to that episiotomy. And no, I didn't change my mind.
Yeah. You're so passionate, but also so eloquent. Like I can tell that the way that you think about this type of stuff is the way that I'm always thinking about these various topics as late in the night as like moments before I fall asleep. I dream about it. I wake up, I pontificate, I meditate on it. These are really, really challenging things. This is not a very easy black and white for a lot of people. And I think especially for men who are listening, I'm curious as like some final concluding remarks. There's a lot of male OBs out there. I do think that they're outnumbered now by women just slightly. But there's a lot of male doctors. This is not just an OB/GYN issue. Informed consent and respecting a person's autonomy and right to refuse treatment, right to informed consent. This is a societal, this is a deeply intertwined with a healthy society, let's say, and especially in medicine, where we have this privilege of cutting into people's bodies, touching parts of their body that maybe aren't touched by anybody but their intimate lover. Like this is really, really important stuff. So for the men out there listening, whatever their industry, how do I want to word this? What do you want them to take from this conversation? What do you want them to understand and maybe start incorporating into their engagement with others, especially women? And then maybe you can piggyback on that. And what do you want to say specifically to the doctors?
Well, what I want to say to the men is the same thing that I want to say to the female OBs, because the female OBs violate the rights of women as much or more than the male OBs. Let's be real. You know what I mean? And so honestly, the female OBs need to look hard. The female OBs need to look hard in the mirror at what it is that makes their empathy for the female birthing patient go out the window, and what makes them step into this power over dynamic that makes them ignore everything they know about what it means to live in a female body. All right. So the fact is that women come to me every day feeling broken and traumatized by non-consented interventions and touchings that happened during the birth of their child, everything from non-consented vaginal exams through non-consented surgeries. And I mean, I guess what everybody needs to understand of all sexes and genders who are providing care to pregnant people is to try to remember what we learned from the Larry Nassar trials. Like what we learned there is that consent really matters to women when it comes to the touching of their reproductive bodies. We saw, the whole nation saw dozens of women stand up, or we read summaries that dozens of women had stood up to say they were suicidal decades after having been touched by a doctor without consent. And it's like, I read that and I was like, what did he do to them? What did he do? Why are they all suicidal? And I poked around to try to figure it out. And it was like, he touched their vagina without their consent, sometimes with an ungloved hand. And it's like, really, ladies, you want to kill yourselves because some man touched a 2-inch part of your body 30 years ago? Well, yeah, Hermine, the answer is yes. They just said that they do. And so what do I have to understand about this? I mean, again, I worked with consent my whole career, and that still blew me away. You want to lose life because some man touched your vagina 30 years ago? I mean, yes, that's what they said. They want to lose life over that. And so what does that tell us, y'all? It tells us that women's vaginas really matter to them. Their reproductive body parts really matter to them. And that there's a very, very, very big difference for a woman between a consented touching of those body parts and a non-consented touching. So this isn't about C-sections. A consented C-section is healthcare, right? A consented vaginal exam is healthcare. But when those things are non-consented, they are assaults and they cause trauma. And just because you got her signature on a form when she was in the most vulnerable condition of her life doesn't mean that you actually got consent. Because just as in contract law, if you get somebody to sign something with a gun to their head or under any kind of duress or manipulation or coercion, that's not a valid contract. And that's what's happening in L&D.
Mm-hmm.
So the process that results in the signature needs to be a legal process. And that legal process involves telling them what you want to do, telling them the alternatives to doing that thing, and telling them accurately, without manipulation, the risks and benefits on both sides of their choices, and then meaningful support in what they want to do. Not, if you do this, I'm here for you, but if you don't, you're all alone during childbirth. Good luck with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what women are dealing with. And that's unethical. And it's widespread and it's cultural to obstetrics. And the only way that I believe as a lawyer that that's going to change is when women stand up for the enforcement of their existing legal rights. And those rights centralize on the right of informed consent and refusal.
I know this was a big part of the trial. So just as a final little snippet, what was the outcome of Angela Hawke's trial? And what were some lasting impressions that you had from the deliberation of the judge? Because this was not a jury. You were not presenting to a jury. This was just a judge. I don't even know. I don't have any legal language, but maybe you can clarify.
The bench trial. In most criminal proceedings, the defendant has a choice between the matter being heard by a jury of their peers, which is a constitutional right, or by a judge. And there can be risks and benefits to going either way with that. Angie's awesome Nebraska team, before I came on the case, chose bench trial, and wisely so, because there were so many complicated legal issues in this case, like the difference between criminal negligence and professional negligence, for example, or the issue of what does it mean to say that Angie caused the baby to be anywhere when the baby was inside the body of another grown-up, stuff like that. And so those are legal questions. Juries are humans, and they're pretty easy to manipulate emotionally, or they can be manipulated on the basis of tragedy, and they're not trained to think, about complicated legal issues. And so this was a bench trial. The judge was, heard, if you watch that YouTube trial, you'll see that he really was very, very thoughtful, very experienced judge, listened very carefully to all of the testimony and evidence. And then on the last day came forward with his verdict. And what he explained was, they could have charged her with practicing medicine or midwifery without a license, but they didn't charge her with that. And so instead they charged her with having caused the death of this child through negligence. And essentially he signaled that was an overreach, because they have to prove every element of that charge. And what was his main points in his opinion were, most importantly, Angie's not guilty. He saves that for the very end of his 10-minute verdict, and we're all on the edge of our chairs, where's he going? Angie's not guilty. And second most important, Americans have a constitutional right to make their medical decisions, including the decision of where to birth their babies.
Mm-hmm.
Pointing to the fundamental autonomy right that all people, men and women, have over our bodies, that underscores the law of informed consent. And in that finding, Nathan, he was validating the ACOG ethics statement. He was repeating what the ACOG ethics statement accurately describes, which is that medical decision-making is a constitutional right. He didn't have to go beyond that to look at applying it to home birth. You know what I mean? He was just saying these folks had a right of medical decision-making. They made their medical decisions. And he said, I'm troubled that we're looking at a criminal proceeding that ultimately is about medical decision-making. He said that was the most troubling thing about the case. God, was this a wise decision? And then he said, again, he could have found her not guilty for a number of different reasons, and the reason he chose to find her not guilty was saying that she was not negligent, which was really big, because the prosecution of midwives always says that they're stupid morons who don't know anything and are defrauding the public by pretending to be an OB or a nurse midwife, which of course is never the case. Midwives are actual experts in physiological birth, and OBs and nurse midwives don't hold that knowledge in the same way. So actually the people choosing for direct entry midwives are choosing for their actual expertise that these other folks don't hold. Just like the folks that choose for a surgeon for a planned C-section are choosing for their actual expertise that the direct entry midwife doesn't hold. And so he held that she wasn't negligent. I mean, because something we didn't mention about my talk with Dr. Lessman is that when we talked through what would have happened at the hospital, and the doctor, again, I respect her for this, acknowledged that Angie did have a right to refuse surgery. And she talked about, okay, if she refused, I would respect it. You know what I mean? And I respect her for saying that, because I know so many OBs that wouldn't have respected it. And honestly, maybe in practice, she would have manipulated this poor laboring woman into a C-section like she does every single time in her career. But at least in theory, she acknowledged she has a right to refuse. And then when we talked through what would have happened if the baby came out, and then if the baby became stuck, which is a risk, just like a risk of a hemorrhage of the C-section is a risk. And so, and when she talked through what she would have done, it was exactly what Angie did. It was exactly what Angie did in practice. And so that was just one more reason that the judge could see that she wasn't negligent. So, because she would have done what the OB did, and the OB already said she would never even know Angie to know what she would have done, let alone do it. So he found that she wasn't negligent. And so those, really the most important takeaway of his holding, this was the first case that I know about in the US where a judge acknowledged that the constitutional right of autonomy applies in childbirth and applies to the choice of where to birth your baby.
This is going to be huge. I feel like this is going to set some precedents, perhaps for some better rulings for other cases. Would you agree? I
absolutely would, but I will note that People magazine and the New York Times were eager to write up the story when it was about midwife kills baby. And then when it actually comes out with an opinion that evolves constitutional law in the United States, crickets, not interested.
Well, we're going to publish it here on the Holistic OB-GYN podcast. I just wanted to give a quick plug, for what you said about midwives struggling to find physicians that support them. There are a handful of us that really, really do align ourselves with a midwifery care model. And that's is really a big part of what my collaborator program is all about, is trying to give these midwives out there who are doing great work. Not every midwife is great. Not every OB-GYN is terrible. But there are a lot of great midwives that can use that support. So if you're listening and you want to learn a little bit more about my collaborator program, go to my website. It's pick the phone up and call me anytime something comes up. We work through we work through clinical scenarios together. We do all of that. Angie was in my program temporarily, but when the trial started getting rolling, she stepped away because I suspect she's going to need some time to heal from this experience and before she gets back out there in the field, although I know that Nebraska needs her. So Hermine, thank you on behalf of the rest of her legal team. Thank you for always showing up in the way that you do and for making some time for me on this silly old podcast. I appreciate you so much and I love you dearly. Thank you.
My pleasure, Nathan. It was wonderful to speak with you today. Thank you.
We will send people your way. If people want to reach out with questions, what is the best way to reach you?
They can access me through my website, which is hayeskleinlaw.com. It's HAYESKLEINLAW.com.
Beautiful. Thank you, Hermine. It was nice to see you again.
Nathan, have a great day. Bye.